I want you to just imagine a scenario for a second. Like, really put yourself there mentally.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
So you're sitting in your house, right? And it's a home your family has occupied for generations. You know every creak in the floorboards. You've got your daily routines perfectly dialed in. Your way of life is completely settled. And honestly, you're just deeply comfortable.
Right. You're totally secure in this carefully curated world you've built.
Exactly. And then suddenly, the front door doesn't just open. The hinges actually splinter. The door is violently kicked down. And standing right there in your hallway is a heavily armed stranger.
Wow. Yeah, that's an incredibly visceral image. And I mean, the terror there isn't just about the physical intrusion, right?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Because this stranger doesn't just want your TV or your wallet. They look at you, they look around your meticulously kept house, and they point a weapon at you. And they demand that you completely and utterly change your entire way of life right this second. Or, they're going to burn the house down with you inside it.
Right. Everything you know, your language, your economy, your social hierarchy, all of it has to be dismantled.
Exactly. It's wild. Welcome to the deep dive, by the way. Today we're unpacking this massive stack of historical texts, economic data, and philosophical diaries from our sources on Theme 7, Paths to Modernization.
And it's such a fascinating collection of materials.
It really is. We're going to look at how three distinct nations, China, Japan, and Korea, reacted when that exact heavily armed stranger showed up on their shores in the 19th century.
Right. In the form of Western colonial powers.
Yeah. Our mission here is to figure out how these three neighbors faced the exact same existential crisis, but forged three wildly different paths into the modern world.
And, we're looking at this not merely as a history lesson, but really as a masterclass in adaptation. Because right now, whether you're sitting in your car or at your desk, you are likely dealing with sudden, massive disruptions in your own life.
Oh, absolutely. Like the dizzying rise of AI in your industry, or, I don't know, shifts in the global economy.
Exactly. Or even radical cultural changes.
Mhm.
And the strategies these three nations used, which were rapid imitation, total systemic revolution, and aggressive state-led economic discipline,
Right.
those mirror the exact ways human beings and organizations attempt to survive overwhelming, non-negotiable change today.
So before we get to the arrival of the heavily armed strangers, we kind of have to look at the quote-unquote houses these nations were living in. Because you can't really understand how a society adapts until you understand what they are adapting from.
That's a great point. And looking at our sources, it becomes immediately clear that geography is often destiny.
Yeah, the texts lay out these brilliant physical contrasts, starting with China, right?
Yeah.
China isn't just a country, it's this vast, sprawling continental empire. It spans multiple climatic zones.
Right, and the core of its civilization is completely dominated by these three massive, life-giving river systems. You have the Yellow River in the north, the Yangtze River in the middle.
Which is the third longest river on the planet, by the way.
Exactly, and the Pearl River down south. And if you want to understand the mechanics of Chinese society at that time, you really have to look at what those rivers created.
Yeah, they carved out these incredibly diverse, deeply rooted regional cultures and economies. And the sources actually highlight this beautifully through food, which I love.
Food is always the best lens.
Right. So in the north, around the Yellow River, it's colder, the soil is drier. So wheat is the staple crop. You get noodles, you get dumplings, but then you move east and south, where there's abundant water for flooded paddies, and suddenly it's a completely rice-based economy.
And then you go west to places like Sichuan, and you get that famous fiery, numbing heat in the cuisine, which actually tells a global story all on its own.
Wait, really? How so?
Well, those Szechuan chilies and spices didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were actually brought in by Portuguese traders navigating maritime routes in the 15th century. And even before that, by Buddhist monks traversing the ancient overland Silk Route.
Oh, wow. I had no idea.
Yeah, the sheer scale of China's geography made it this massive absorbent sponge of a civilization.
Mm.
It was a self-contained universe that could absorb foreign elements like chilies or, even conquering dynasties and simply make them Chinese over time.
Right. So it's this massive, diverse continent with deep topsoil and endless horizons. But then you look across the water at Japan, and the contrast couldn't be starker.
Completely different.
Japan is a string of jagged islands. It's highly mountainous. The sources point out this crazy geographic limitation, actually. Only a tiny fraction of the land on the main islands is even vaguely flat enough for typical agricultural use.
And to make matters more precarious, it sits right on top of incredibly active tectonic plates. It's a relentless earthquake zone.
Which fundamentally dictated their architecture, right, and their psychology, and just their daily survival. Unlike the rolling plains of China, Japan lacked the physical space for a strong tradition of animal rearing. You just couldn't have massive herds of cattle roaming around.
Right. So where do you get your protein? You
Hmm.
look to the geographic feature that defines you, which is the sea. Their diet became heavily reliant on rice grown in tightly terraced valleys and fish pulled straight from the ocean.
Which, as the text notes, evolved into the sushi and sashimi we know today. Which is wild because we look at sushi now as this premium, globally recognized health food. But originally it was just a highly efficient, necessary caloric adaptation.
Exactly, to living on a rocky, earthquake-prone island with practically no cows.
Right, so you have the vast, river-dominated continental sponge of China, and then the tightly packed, mountainous, geologically volatile island chain of Japan. These two completely different landscapes cultivated completely different political foundations.
Which perfectly sets up our first major pivot in this deep dive. Let's look at how Japan went from the secluded, floating world of art, poetry, and samurai to a gritty, roaring, mass production factory floor almost overnight.
Yeah, to understand how they pulled off this pivot, we have to look at the incredibly strange political system they were running. By the mid-19th century, Japan had been existing in a state of deliberate, highly engineered isolation for over 200 years under the Tokugawa shogunate.
Right. The Tokugawa family had essentially frozen Japanese society in place to prevent the endless civil wars that had plagued their past.
Now, I always get a little tripped up on the power dynamic here, because we have an emperor, but we also have a shogun. How did that actually work on a day-to-day basis?
It's a really crucial distinction. The emperor existed, yes, but he was entirely a figurehead. He lived a deeply cloistered, purely ceremonial life in Kyoto. He performed religious rites, wrote poetry,
So no real power.
zero political or military power. The absolute undeniable power lay with the shogun, who was the military dictator and head of the Tokugawa family. The shogun ruled from Edo, which we now know as Tokyo.
Okay, got it.
And the mechanics of how the shogun controlled the country were brilliant, but also paranoid and ultimately fragile. He divided the Japanese islands into roughly 250 distinct domains.
That's a lot of separate domains.
Yeah, and each one was ruled by a regional warlord called a daimyo. And serving these daimyo were the samurai, the elite warrior class.
But the shogun didn't just say, like, okay, you 250 warlords promise to be good, right? He instituted a system that essentially held them hostage. I always think of it as this high-stakes corporate non-compete clause, but enforced by mutually assured destruction.
That is a very apt way to look at it, actually. It was called the Senkin Kotai, or the alternate attendance system. The shogun legally ordered every single daimyo to spend alternating years living in the capital city of Edo.
Right, and here's the crazy part.
Yeah, when a daimyo went back to his home domain, he had to leave his wife and children behind in Edo as literal hostages of the shogun.
It's genius, honestly, but completely ruthless.
Oh, absolutely. And the economic mechanism of the system is what really shaped modern Japan. By forcing these lords to constantly travel back and forth with massive entourages of samurai and forcing them to maintain lavish, expensive residences in Edo just to keep up appearances.
He ensured they were constantly draining their wealth.
Exactly. If a daimyo is spending 70% of his domain's GDP on travel expenses and rent in the capital, he literally cannot afford to secretly buy muskets and fund a startup rebellion back home.
Right, but there is a massive unintended consequence to this, right? Because of this enforced migration and this massive concentration of wealth, plus thousands of idle samurai hanging around, Edo completely exploded in size.
It really did.
The sources state that by the mid-17th century, Edo wasn't just a big city, it was the most populated city in the entire world. Bigger than London.
Yeah.
Bigger than Paris.
Because you had hundreds of thousands of people moving in just to service this elite class. The samurai, who had historically been battlefield killers, effectively transitioned into a literate, bureaucratic ruling elite. Because, well, there were no wars left to fight.
Right, they were just administrators now.
Yeah. And beneath them, a massive, vibrant, commercial class of merchants, the chonin, grew rapidly to sell them goods, lend them money, provide entertainment. In this bustling urban environment, a person's financial acumen really began to silently supersede their traditional feudal status.
And the cultural output of this piece is staggering. The literacy rates were completely off the charts. The sources point out that in Edo, people could literally rent a book for the price of a bowl of noodles.
Ah,
I just love that economic benchmark.
it's a great detail. And it wasn't just the ultra-rich aristocratic elites reading,
Yeah.
right? It was ordinary merchants and artisans.
Exactly. And this cultural blossoming was distinctly, proudly Japanese. The texts highlight the silk industry in the Nishigen district of Kyoto, which became globally renowned for its breathtaking quality. But even deeper than that was an indigenous cultural pride that stretched back centuries. The text brings up the tale of the Genji, written during the Heian period by a woman, Murasaki Shikibu. It's widely considered the world's first novel.
And the mechanics of how it was written are so important here. It wasn't written in the complex, imported Chinese characters, the kanji, that the male bureaucrats used for official government business.
Right, to use something else.
Exactly. It was written using a native Japanese phonetic script called hiragana. At the time, this script was considered the domain of women, and it allowed them to express Japanese spoken nuances perfectly.
Wow.
The novel depicts an incredibly sophisticated aristocratic world where women possessed a striking degree of cultural agency. It proves that Japan had a deeply sophisticated internal cultural identity and a high degree of social organization long before they ever had to look at the West.
Okay, so this is the house Japan is living in. It's relatively peaceful, it's highly literate, it's churning out incredible art, and it is entirely self-contained. And then the door gets kicked in. The year is 1853. American Commodore Matthew Perry sails into Edo Bay with a fleet of heavily armed, coal-burning, steam-powered warships, the famous Black Ships.
Right.
He literally points his cannons directly at the wooden city of Edo and essentially delivers an ultimatum. Like, open your ports to American trade, sign these unequal treaties, or we will open your ports for you with high explosive artillery.
And the psychological shock to the Japanese leadership simply cannot be overstated. They had been watching what was happening to the massive Chinese empire next door at the hands of Western powers.
Yeah, they saw the writing on the wall.
They realized with terrifying clarity that all their sophisticated culture, their beautifully crafted samurai swords, and their wooden coastal defenses were absolutely mathematically useless against Western industrial military might. They were staring straight down the barrel of colonization.
Okay, wait. Let's really pause here, because this is where my mind always gets blown by this specific moment in history.
Yeah.
Japan is this proud, self-contained, warrior ethos society. Perry shows up with big guns. And instead of launching a doomed, romantic, last samurai-style war to defend their ancient honor, the leadership looks at the American guns,
Yeah.
they look at their own swords, and they decide to completely voluntarily dismantle their own ruling class.
Right.
Like, to rewrite their entire society. It's like a legacy company instantly pivoting to AI because a tech giant moved in next door.
Yeah.
How does a ruling class just agree to abolish itself?
Well, it wasn't entirely voluntary for everyone, and it certainly wasn't peaceful. It did trigger a brief but intense civil war. But what happens is arguably the most rapid, pragmatic, and dramatic pivot in modern national history. It's known as the Meiji Restoration of 1868.
Okay.
Internal discontent with the shogun's absolute inability to protect the country from the Americans just boiled over. A movement of younger, highly pragmatic, lower-ranking samurai from the outer domains realized the Tokugawa system was obsolete. They forcibly overthrew the shogun.
Wow.
But here's the genius part. They didn't just declare themselves the new dictators.
Right, because nobody would have accepted that. They needed legitimacy.
Exactly. So they did something brilliant. They went to Kyoto, took that cloistered poetry-writing figurehead of an emperor, and brought him right out of the shadows. They moved him to Edo, renamed the city Tokyo, which literally means Eastern Capital, and declared to the nation that they were restoring absolute power to the emperor.
So they took the ultimate ancient symbol of Japanese divine tradition and essentially wore it like a mask to legitimize a total radical modernization of the country. Like, we aren't destroying tradition, we are obeying the emperor.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And once they had that legitimacy, this new oligarchy adopted a chillingly pragmatic national slogan, Fukoku Kyuhei, which translates to rich country, strong army.
Rich country, strong army.
Yeah. They looked at the West and realized a cold, hard truth. To resist the West, we have to become exactly like the West. We have to industrialize, we have to centralize, and we have to do it yesterday. And this is where that high literacy rate and that phonetic script we talked about earlier becomes their absolute secret weapon.
Oh, this makes so much sense. You can't build a modern factory-based industrial economy if your population can't read technical manuals or understand government decrees or do basic math.
Exactly.
The text points out how their language structure gave them a massive speed advantage. They had the complex Chinese kanji characters, but because Japanese grammar is completely different from Chinese, they had developed those two phonetic alphabets alongside them,
Yeah.
hiragana and katakana.
Right. And if we look at the mechanics of knowledge transfer, having a phonetic syllabary where symbols represent sounds rather than whole concepts meant that knowledge didn't remain locked up exclusively with elite scholars.
Right, the guys who had the luxury of spending decades memorizing thousands of complex characters.
Exactly. Ideas, translations of Western engineering texts, and new laws could spread rapidly to the wider society. The Meiji government capitalized on this pre-existing literacy aggressively. By the 1870s, they didn't just encourage education, they launched a massive mandatory new school system.
Schooling became compulsory for both boys and girls, right?
It did. By 1910, attendance was practically universal. They intentionally engineered a unified, educated, modern workforce out of a decentralized feudal peasantry in less than a single generation.
It is a stunning logistical achievement. It sounds like the perfect success story on a macroeconomic spreadsheet. But I have to push back here.
Okay, go ahead.
You cannot just wrench an entire civilization from feudalism to heavy industry in 3 decades without someone, somewhere, paying a terrible, terrible price. Where did the capital for all this come from? What was the actual human cost of hitting the fast-forward button on the Industrial Revolution?
Well, and pay it they did. The Meiji government's drive for modernization was ruthlessly pragmatic. To buy those steam engines, to import foreign engineering advisors, and to build massive modern infrastructure like the first railway line between Tokyo and Yokohama in 1872, the government needed hard cash.
Yeah.
And the only real source of wealth in Japan at that time was agriculture. So in 1873, they instituted a devastatingly heavy national land tax on the farmers. The rural peasantry essentially bore the crushing financial weight of Japan's entire industrial revolution on their back.
They're squeezing the farmers dry. And where is that money going? It's not just going to public works. The government is deliberately funneling it into these massive, hand-picked corporate conglomerates, right? The zaibatsu?
Yes, the mechanics of the zaibatsu are crucial to understand. The government realized they didn't have time to wait for a natural free market to develop heavy industry, so they aggressively subsidized and provided massive tax loopholes to specific, politically connected merchant families, names you still know today, like Mitsubishi and Sumitomo. The state would literally build a factory or a shipyard with taxpayer money and then sell it to a zaibatsu at a fraction of its value. These families formed massive holding companies that controlled their own banks, which in turn funded their own industrial arms. They monopolized the economy to rapidly build up heavy industries, particularly shipbuilding and mining, so Japan could control its own supply chains.
It was essentially state-sponsored oligopoly. It successfully built an industrial economy at lightning speed, but it created intense, staggering inequality. And we see this in the massive demographic shifts.
Oh, absolutely.
The sources note that the number of people working in manufacturing skyrocketed from 700,000 in 1870 to 4 million by 1913. That is millions of people being pushed off their heavily taxed farms and pouring into these newly built, completely unregulated factories.
Yeah.
And here is a demographic statistic from the text that I think completely changes how we view the Industrial Revolution. Over half of those modern factory workers in Japan were women.
It's a vital piece of the puzzle. Young women, often sold into contracts by their impoverished rural families to pay those exact same agricultural taxes, were the absolute backbone of Japan's early textile boom. The silk and cotton they wove generated the foreign currency needed to buy warships and steel mills.
Unbelievable.
But the mechanics of their daily lives were horrific. They worked in cramped, deafeningly loud, lint-filled factories for 14 hours a day, living in locked company dormitories. Tuberculosis ran rampant.
But they didn't just take it.
No, they didn't. They had immense agency within their limited power. It was actually these young, heavily exploited female workers who organized Japan's very first modern labor strike in 1886.
Wow.
They walked out of a silk mill in protest of horrific conditions and pay cuts, proving that the imported Western industrial model also imported Western-style labor class consciousness.
And the exploitation wasn't limited to human labor either. The physical environment of Japan was absolutely pillaged. The sources give us this incredible, almost cinematic historical anecdote about a man named Tanaka Shoso. This feels like a story ripped from a modern environmental documentary.
Tanaka Shozo is one of the most fascinating figures of the Meiji era. He was the self-taught son of a village headman who actually managed to get elected to the very first Diet, which was Japan's newly established parliament.
Right.
By 1897, he became the face of a massive, catastrophic environmental crisis. Because the Zaibatsu were operating with zero environmental regulations, the rapid growth of industry was poisoning the ancient landscape. Specifically, the Ashio copper mine, owned by the Furukawa Zaibatsu, was dumping massive amounts of toxic sulfur dioxide and heavy metals directly into the Wataras River system.
The scale of the destruction is hard to fathom. The text points out that it poisoned 100 square miles of prime agricultural farmland. It directly devastated 1,000 families. The fish died, the crops withered, the drinking water became toxic.
Total devastation.
It was a complete ecological nightmare, directly subsidized by the state's modernization drive.
And Shozo understood that writing polite letters to bureaucrats wasn't going to stop a Zaibatsu. So he did something unprecedented in modern Japanese history. He led 800 desperate, poisoned villagers in a mass, highly visible protest against both the corporation and the government.
Which was incredibly dangerous.
Very. He agitated so fiercely, even famously attempting to directly hand a petition to the emperor's carriage, which was a deeply taboo act, that he actually forced the Meiji government to enact their first real pollution control measures.
Wow.
It was definitive proof that the Grand Modernization project was severely bleeding the very citizens it claimed to be strengthening.
It's a stark reminder that macroeconomic progress is almost always paid for with someone else's lungs, labor, and land. But as dark as the domestic cost was, the external cost of Japan's pivot was far darker. Because as Japan successfully built its rich country, it also built its strong army. And they didn't just build it for defense, they used it.
Which brings us to a terrifying structural flaw in their new government. When Japan adopted a Western-style constitution, they chose to model their new Diet on the Prussian, or German, system.
Right.
This meant the parliament had very limited powers, mostly over the budget. But crucially, the military bureaucracy, the army and navy, were placed under the direct independent command of the emperor. They operated completely outside the control of the elected civilian government.
Wait, so the prime minister couldn't give orders to the generals?
Exactly.
So you have a highly advanced, heavily armed, deeply nationalistic military operating with zero democratic leash. That is a recipe for disaster.
Absolutely. And the military's logic, given the ruthless geopolitical reality of 19th century imperialism, was that the only way to ensure Western powers wouldn't eventually carve up Japan was for Japan to carve out its own empire first.
Right. Eat or be eaten.
Exactly. They needed strategic buffer zones, and desperately, they needed natural resources like iron and coal, which their islands lacked. So Japan aggressively went on the offensive. In 1894, they went to war with the massive Chinese Empire and, shocking the globe with their modern tactics, defeated them and seized Taiwan.
Wow.
Then, in 1905, they did the absolute unthinkable. They defeated a major European power, Russia, in the Russo-Japanese War, and by 1910, they had formally annexed the entire Korean peninsula as a colony.
So to avoid being colonized by the West, they literally became the colonizer of the East. They studied the Western imperialist playbook, adapted it, and said, we can do this more efficiently than you.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened.
But I want to dig into the psychology of this. If you are a Japanese intellectual living through this era, you know your history. You know you share deep cultural and historical ties with China and Korea. How did the thinkers and writers of the day justify becoming the very monsters they had feared just a few decades prior?
That tension sparked a massive, agonizing ideological debate within Japan. Looking at the sources, we see two fundamentally opposed camps. On one side, you had thinkers like Fukuzawa Yukichi. He was arguably the most influential intellectual of the Meiji era, a man who had traveled extensively in the US and Europe.
Okay.
His conclusion was brutal, driven by the social Darwinism prevalent at the time. He argued that to survive, Japan literally had to expel Asia.
Expel Asia. That is such a harsh survivalist phrase.
Yeah.
What did he actually mean mechanically by that?
He meant that Japan must aggressively shed its Asian characteristics, reject the perceived backwardness and weakness of its neighbors, and entirely adopt the spirit, the industry, and the ruthless imperialist logic of the West. He argued that if Japan acted like an Asian nation, it would be conquered like one.
Wow.
It was a philosophy of eat or be eaten, and he advocated treating China and Korea with the same colonial harshness the West used.
Who was pushing back against that? Because surely not everyone agreed with abandoning their entire regional identity.
Right. On the other side, you had philosophers and journalists like Miyake Setsure. He strongly argued against this blind, total imitation of the West. He believed that every nation had special, unique talents. He argued that Japan should focus on developing its own indigenous culture and national pride, not to violently dominate its neighbors, but to contribute to the broader, diverse interest of world civilization.
So be modern, but still be Japanese.
Exactly. He wanted Japan to be a distinctly and proudly Japanese modern nation, not just a ruthless carbon copy of a European empire.
But history shows us which side won that debate, unfortunately. The militarists and the expansionists took Fukazawa's logic to its absolute horrifying extreme, leading to the devastation of the first half of the 20th century.
Exactly. So Japan's path was rapid, state-directed imitation that mutated into aggressive imperialism. But what happens if a nation is too vast, too deeply rooted in its ancient ways, and too decentralized to make that lightning-fast pivot? Let's look across the water at China.
Because, while Japan pivoted, the massive continental empire of the Qing dynasty reacted completely differently, leading to what is known as the Century of Humiliation. At the start of the 19th century, China was arguably the wealthiest, most self-sufficient empire on Earth.
Oh, without a doubt.
They possessed a profound sense of cultural superiority, viewing the arriving Westerners as mere uncultured barbarians. But the Westerners, specifically the British, didn't need military superiority initially. They had an economic weapon that would rot China from the inside out.
Yes. To understand the collapse of the Qing dynasty, we really have to look closely at the mechanics of the triangular trade and the resulting opium wars. This is a masterclass in aggressive, state-backed economic warfare. Let's trace the money.
Okay, let's trace it.
In the early 19th century, Britain desperately wanted Chinese goods. The demand in London for Chinese tea, fine silk, and porcelain was absolutely insatiable. But the King Emperor strictly controlled trade through the Canton system, and frankly, China didn't need or want any of Britain's manufactured goods. They only accepted payment in one thing: hard silver specie.
Which created a massive macroeconomic crisis for the British Empire. Right. Silver was hemorrhaging out of the British economy and flowing directly into China's vaults.
Right.
The British East India Company, which acted less like a modern company and more like a heavily armed sovereign state, realized this balance of trade deficit was entirely unsustainable. They desperately needed a product that the Chinese population would actually buy to reverse the flow of silver, and they found that product in their neighboring colony, India.
The East India Company realized they controlled the prime agricultural land in Bengal, India, so they forced the cultivation of opium poppies on an industrial scale.
The logistics of this are genuinely evil genius. My analogy for this is like, imagine a modern-day global superpower deciding to balance its cyber national budget by acting as a state-sponsored narco cartel, intentionally flooding a geopolitical rival with highly addictive, life-destroying narcotics.
That is precisely what it was. The East India Company harvested the opium in India, shipped it to the Chinese coast, and sold it to local Chinese smugglers in exchange for silver.
Right.
The British then took that exact same silver, turned around, and legally used it to buy the tea and silk for the London market. This was the triangular trade. Manufactured goods to India, Indian opium to China, Chinese tea to Britain. It was incredibly, unfathomably lucrative for the British, and it triggered a total societal collapse in China.
Because it wasn't just a trade imbalance anymore, it was an epidemic. Millions of Chinese citizens, from bureaucrats to laborers, became hopelessly addicted to opium. The productivity of the workforce plummeted.
Yeah, the human toll was staggering.
And the economic drain was devastating. As the silver flowed out of China to pay for the drugs, it deflated the local copper currency that the peasants used. Suddenly, a peasant's tax burden effectively doubled because silver became so rare and expensive. It hollowed out the economy from the bottom up.
Exactly.
And when the Qing government finally desperately tried to enforce their own laws, banned the trade, and famously burned massive stockpiles of British opium in 1839.
The British Empire sent in their steam-powered gunboats in the name of defending free trade and private property. Those were the Opium Wars. And the military mismatch was catastrophic.
Yeah, it wasn't even close.
British shallow draft steamships could navigate up the Chinese rivers, entirely bypassing coastal forts, and use modern, high explosive artillery to decimate the Chinese wooden junks and land forces. The Qing dynasty was utterly humiliated. They were forced to sign a series of unequal treaties at gunpoint.
Ceding sovereign territory like Hong Kong, right?
Yes, opening multiple ports to foreign control and allowing the devastating drug trade to continue unabated.
It completely shattered the aura of invincibility that the Qing rulers held over their people. And our sources reveal something deeply poignant about how Chinese intellectuals processed this trauma. They weren't just looking inward at their own failing government, they were looking outward, frantically studying the rest of the globe, watching other nations be devoured by the colonial machine.
Right, they were hyper-aware of global events.
Here, there's a specific linguistic detail in the text that stopped me in my tracks. They were so acutely, terrifyingly aware of how the European powers had partitioned and erased Poland from the map in the late 18th century, that the word Poland actually evolved into a verb in Chinese discourse.
Yes, the phrase was Bolan Wo, which translates literally to Poland, us. It perfectly captures the existential dread of the era. To Poland, us meant to be carved up, partitioned into spheres of influence, and legally erased from the map by foreign empires.
That is so bleak.
And if Poland was a distant, abstract fear, the fate of India was the immediate, terrifying nightmare happening right next door. India became the ultimate cautionary tale for Chinese intellectuals.
The prominent reformer Liang Qichao wrote extensively about this, right? I want to dig into his logic.
Lin Keqiao was a brilliant thinker who traveled the world, and he wrote with absolute horror about the reality of India. He pointed out that India was a massive, ancient, heavily populated civilization, very much like China, yet it was entirely subjugated and destroyed, not even by a rival sovereign government initially, but by a corporation. The British East India Company, a non-country, as he called it.
Right.
That fact shook Chinese thinkers to their absolute core. How could an ancient civilization fall to a company ledger?
And what's fascinating, and a bit uncomfortable, is that they directed a lot of fury at the Indian population itself. The text notes that Chinese thinkers actively criticized the Indians for being subservient, for allowing themselves to be colonized.
Yes, there's a lot of harsh judgment.
And the deepest anger was reserved for the fact that the British routinely used Indian colonial soldiers, the sepoys, to fight in the British wars against China. They looked at India and concluded, if we don't wake up right now, we won't just be subjugated, we will be forced into uniform to fight our oppressors' wars against other victims.
That terrifying realization forced an agonizing foundational reckoning within Chinese society. For over 2 millennia, the absolute bedrock that held Chinese civilization together was Confucianism. This was a deep philosophical system based on strict hierarchy, proper social relationships, reverence for tradition, and ultimate respect for elders and imperial authority.
It had worked for a really long time.
It had successfully created a remarkably stable, enduring society. But suddenly, when faced with Western gunboats and industrial economics, this reverence for the past was viewed not as a cultural strength, but as a fatal, paralyzing vulnerability.
It's the realization that you cannot fight a steam-powered warship with a beautifully written poem about filial piety. The old operating system was completely incompatible with the new hardware of the world.
And the most staggering, tangible symbol of this internal tearing down of tradition occurred in 1905. The Qing government, in a last-ditch, desperate attempt to modernize and save themselves, fully abolished the civil service examination system.
We really need to pause and explain the mechanics of this, because it is hard for a modern mind to grasp the scale of this change. The civil service exam wasn't just a difficult test you took to get a government job. It was the entire social, educational, and political operating system of the Chinese elite for over 1,000 years.
Exactly. Entry into the ruling gentry class, which consisted of over 1 million influential people, was dictated almost entirely by your ability to pass these incredibly grueling multi-day exams held in tiny, isolated cells.
And what were you tested on? Not administration, not economics, not engineering. You were tested purely on your mastery of classical Confucian literature and your ability to write highly rigid, stylized essays known as the eight-legged essay.
Right.
Families would pool their resources to allow a talented son to study these ancient texts from childhood well into his 30s or 40s.
It was, in theory, an incredible system of intellectual meritocracy. A poor farmer's son could become a powerful minister if he was brilliant enough. But it was entirely backward-looking. As reformers realized, memorizing a thousand-year-old philosophy text had absolutely zero relevance for building a modern artillery piece, or structuring a central bank, or negotiating a railway contract.
Right, he was actively holding them back.
It acted as an immense structural barrier to the development of practical science and technology because it siphoned all the best minds into studying poetry.
So in 1905, the government simply abolished it overnight. I want you to really imagine the psychological shock of that. Imagine if a modern government suddenly passed a law declaring that every single university degree, every law degree, every medical license was legally meaningless, and they completely dismantled the entire educational infrastructure in a single day.
The panic would be unimaginable.
What happens to the millions of young men who had spent their entire lives and their families' entire fortunes studying for an exam that no longer exists? Their entire life's purpose, their entire path to social mobility is evaporated instantly.
Yeah.
It's an act of utter, flailing desperation by a dying dynasty. Because overthrowing a system, tearing down the old house is one thing. Building a new, functional one to replace it is infinitely harder. And the Qing dynasty couldn't do it. Despite these radical last-minute reforms, they were fatally weakened from within and without. The empire finally collapsed in 1911, ending over 2,000 years of imperial rule. A republic was established under Sun Yat-sen.
But simply removing the emperor didn't magically solve China's deep structural problems. It merely opened a massive, chaotic power vacuum. Warlords fractured the country, and this ideological vacuum sets the stage for a brutal struggle over what a modern China should actually look like.
Which brings us to a period of incredible ideological ferment. And before we dive into this, the tale of two Chinas, I want to make something extremely clear to you, our listener. As we discuss the Kuomintang, the KMT, and the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, we are strictly relaying the historical facts as presented in our source material. We are taking absolutely no political side here, just impartially unpacking the mechanics of these two movements.
Right. So Sun Yat-sen, who is universally regarded across all political divides as the founder of modern China, tried to build a foundation on his famous three principles of the people. Nationalism, which meant forcefully kicking out foreign imperialists, democracy, to establish a modern representative government, and socialism, which meant regulating runaway capital and equalizing the massive disparities in land holdings.
But the immediate reality was chaos and warlordism. The anger of the younger generation, who felt betrayed by the weakness of the new government, finally exploded in 1919 in what became known as the May 4th movement. Initially, this was a massive, furious, student-led protest in Beijing. They were protesting the decisions of the post-World War I Versailles Peace Conference, which had hypocritically allowed Japan to keep colonial control over Chinese territory in Shandong province.
But looking at the sources, the May 4th movement quickly morphed from a political protest into a total radical cultural revolution. The new generation looked at the failure of 1911 and concluded getting rid of the emperor wasn't enough. We have to burn the entire cultural foundation down to the bedrock.
Wow.
They attacked the core of Confucian tradition. They loudly called for an end to the brutal practice of foot binding, an end to the absolute subjugation of women in the household, and an end to arranged marriages.
They even revolutionized the language itself,
Yeah.
right? They championed the use of baihua, or plain, everyday spoken language, in literature and journalism. They entirely rejected the dense, elite classical Chinese that had locked the common people out of intellectual discourse for centuries. They were trying to build a modern, inclusive national consciousness from scratch.
And out of this intense intellectual ferment and political chaos, two major, highly organized forces eventually emerged, both desperately striving to unite and modernize the fractured country. You had the Kuomintang, often abbreviated as the KMT or the Nationalist Party, which eventually came under the military leadership of Chiang Kai-shek. And you had the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, founded in 1921, which eventually centralized under the leadership of Mao Zedong.
And looking strictly at the sociological data, the primary texts, and historical records from this era, what becomes incredibly apparent is that these two parties didn't just have different political theories. They inhabited and represented two completely different, fundamentally incompatible physical realities within China.
Exactly. Let's examine the KMT's reality first. The urban scene. Their power base was heavily concentrated in the coastal cities, most notably Shanghai. And the sources provide a deeply illuminating, unexpected historical anecdote about Shanghai in the 1930s that perfectly captures the chaotic, highly stratified, cosmopolitan nature of urban China at the time. It's the story of Buck Clayton.
Oh, I found this part so fascinating.
Yes, Buck Clayton was a talented Black American jazz trumpet player. He traveled to Shanghai in 1935 to live and work with his orchestra. On one level, he lived a life of relative privilege as a sought-after expatriate musician playing in the opulent high-end hotels of the international settlement. But the racial and colonial dynamics he meticulously observed and recorded in his diaries are fascinating.
He writes about a specific incident where he and his bandmates were physically assaulted by white Americans, often U.S. Marines who were also living in Shanghai, who violently threw the black musicians out of a hotel establishment. But Clayton makes a profound observation. He notes that the Chinese onlookers treated the black musicians, and I'm quoting his exact words here, like a winning football team.
It's a brilliant sociological microhistory. Clayton realized that because he and his band were clear, visible victims of racial discrimination and violence by white Americans, he shared a deep, unspoken solidarity with the local Chinese population.
Right.
The Chinese citizens were intimately familiar with that exact same humiliation. They were routinely treated as second-class citizens, barred from certain parks and establishments in their own sovereign city by the foreign colonial powers who controlled the police and the courts.
Clayton also looked beyond the jazz clubs and observed the grueling, absolute poverty of the urban underclass. He wrote vividly about seeing 20 or 30 coolies pulling a big, heavy cart that in America would be pulled by a truck or horses. He referred to these desperately poor laborers as human horses. And this observation perfectly highlights the fatal structural flaw in the KMT's approach to modernization.
Exactly. The Kuomintang's social base was dangerously narrow. They relied heavily on urban industrialists, bankers, and the emerging middle class. They attempted to modernize China from the top down, focusing on urban infrastructure and militarizing society.
Even enforcing moral codes, right?
Yeah, they ridiculously dictated things like the exact length of women's hemlines and demanded rigid public hygiene. But in focusing so heavily on the elite urban veneer, they largely ignored the crushing, systemic poverty of the massive working class, the human horses Clayton described, and more importantly, the vast rural peasantry.
It's wild. You have this hyper-modern, cosmopolitan scene of jazz clubs, neon lights, and intense political journalism happening in the coastal enclaves, utterly disconnected from the rest of the country. Meanwhile, a completely different, mathematically massive reality, a radical peasant revolution, is forming deep in the rural mountains.
Yeah.
We have to talk about Mao Zedong's approach because it was mechanically the opposite of the KMT.
While the Kuomintang focused their resources on controlling the cities, Mao Zedong realized early on that the true, untapped engine of revolution in an agrarian empire like China was the vast, deeply impoverished peasantry. After being violently purged from the cities by the KMT in 1927, Mao and the CCP retreated and set up radical rural bases, or Soviets, in the remote mountains of Jiangxi province. And Mao's approach to modernization wasn't just abstract Marxist theory imported from Russia. It was deeply, brutally empirical.
This is where the mechanics get really dark. Mao didn't just guess what the peasants wanted. He conducted intense, granular sociological surveys of rural exploitation.
The famous Hunwu investigation is a prime example. Mao personally gathered meticulous statistics on everyday commodities, land ownership, and debt structures. But he also documented the horrific human cost of the agrarian crisis, particularly human trafficking. He recorded the exact numbers of desperate peasants who were forced by systemic starvation and crushing landlord debt to literally sell their own children just to survive.
The economic data on this from our sources is chilling. He noted that young boys were routinely sold for 100 to 200 yuan, because boy represented future hard physical labor in the fields. But there were almost no instances of girls being sold in these specific markets simply because, in a starving agrarian economy, a girl couldn't provide the heavy labor required to justify the purchase price. They were often abandoned or subjected to infanticide.
It was based on these brutal, undeniable economic realities that Mao formulated his policies. In these rural Soviets, the CCP didn't just preach, they acted. They violently confiscated and redistributed land from the wealthy landlords directly to the poor peasants. Crucially, Mao heavily championed women's rights as a core revolutionary tool.
Right. He saw the strategic value there.
He understood that women were the most oppressed demographic in the country. He actively supported the creation of rural women's associations. He promulgated radical new marriage laws that strictly forbade arranged marriages, and he made the purchase and sale of marriage contracts illegal. He offered a total radical restructuring of daily survival for the lowest strata of society.
So you have these two fundamentally incompatible visions of modernization. The urban, top-down, militarized KMT and the rural, bottom-up, agrarian CCP, and they are locked in a brutal, decades-long civil war.
Hmm.
This conflict was only briefly paused when Japan launched its horrific full-scale invasion of China in 1937, leading to a war of sheer survival.
Right.
But fast-forwarding past the devastation of World War II, the CCP ultimately outmaneuvers the KMT, emerges victorious in 1949, and Mao establishes the People's Republic of China. But as the texts clearly show, the story of Chinese modernization and the extreme human cost of it certainly doesn't end in 1949.
No, in many ways, the most turbulent attempts at modernization were just beginning. The CCP achieved their foundational goal of violently removing foreign imperialist influence and uniting the massive country under a highly centralized, powerful state apparatus. But Mao's subsequent drive to rapidly modernize the economy entirely through sheer ideological willpower and mass mobilization led to catastrophic mechanical failures. The text specifically mentioned the Great Leap Forward, launched in 1958.
The goal of the Great Leap Forward was to transform China from an agrarian economy into a modern industrial society in literally a few years.
Yeah.
They attempted to do this by forcing the peasantry into massive, rigidly controlled agricultural communes. But the industrial aspect is what's truly mind-boggling to me. They encouraged millions of peasants to build backyard furnaces to produce steel.
And this is where the mechanics of ideology clashing with physical reality becomes tragic. The party believed that mass enthusiasm could overcome technical expertise. They demanded localized steel production quotas. So peasants, lacking actual iron ore, melted down their vital agricultural tools, their cooking wokes, even doorknobs, using wood fires in these small book furnaces.
But chemically, metallurgically, why is that such a disaster?
Because you cannot make high-quality industrial steel in a wood-fired brick oven. Steel requires precise temperature control, blast furnaces, and the exact balancing of carbon and iron. Melting down cast iron in a backyard simply produces brittle, low-quality pig iron that shatters under stress and is completely unusable for modern industry or construction.
Oh, wow.
It was a massive, tragic misallocation of human labor. Millions of farmers were pulled away from the harvest to make useless slag, which contributed directly to one of the most devastating man-made famines in human history.
And despite that economic catastrophe, the ideological zealotry only intensified, culminating in the Cultural Revolution, launched in 1966. Mao, fearing the party was becoming too bureaucratic and losing its revolutionary fire, mobilized the Red Guards, who were mostly massive groups of radicalized high school and university students. He gave them a mandate to violently destroy the four olds: old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits.
It was a period of immense localized terror. Professionals, teachers, and intellectuals were violently purged, publicly humiliated, and sent to the remote countryside for re-education through hard labor. Ancient temples and historical artifacts were smashed.
Yeah.
As the source text explicitly notes, the governing philosophy was that ideology was more important than having professional knowledge. If you were a brilliant engineer but your political fervor was questioned, you were removed. It was a period of profound social trauma that severely disrupted higher education and paralyzed the economy for a decade.
But then, history violently pivots again. Mao dies in 1976. The radical faction is removed. And by 1978, a new leader, Deng Xiaoping, fully consolidates power and initiates a breathtaking, pragmatic reversal of course. He introduces what became known as the Four Modernizations, focusing strictly on developing science, industry, agriculture, and defense.
Deng essentially looked at the stagnation of the previous decades and pivoted the massive country toward what is termed a socialist market economy. The mechanics of this were brilliant and delicate. He maintained the absolute strict political monopoly of the Communist Party, but he slowly, methodically opened the door to capitalist economic mechanisms.
Right.
He decollectivized agriculture, allowed private enterprise to flourish, and established special economic zones to attract massive foreign investment in technology.
It was, by any macroeconomic metric, a wildly successful economic strategy. It resulted in double-digit growth for decades, lifted hundreds of millions of people out of absolute poverty, and transformed China into the high-tech, global manufacturing powerhouse it is today. However, the historical sources highlight a critical, unresolved tension in this dual approach. While the government rapidly expanded economic freedom, they strictly limited and suppressed political freedom.
And the texts specifically anchor this tension with a famous incident from exactly that pivot point in 1978. During a brief period of open debate, a former Red Guard named Wei Jingsheng posted a daring essay on a brick wall in Beijing, which became known as Democracy Wall. The poster was boldly titled The Fifth Modernization.
And his argument was incredibly potent. He proclaimed that without democracy, the vital fifth modernization, the other four, science, industry, agriculture, defense, would ultimately come to nothing. He publicly criticized the party for failing to end poverty over the past decades and boldly asserted that true modernization requires the political agency and human rights of the individual citizens, not just a rising GDP.
And what happened to him?
He was promptly arrested and imprisoned for over a decade.
Wow. But his poster proved that even as the factories hummed and the economy boomed, the underlying deeply human question of what a fully modern, just society should look like remained hotly contested by the people living inside it.
So we've explored Japan's rapid top-down imperialist pivot. We've traced China's agonizing century of total revolution, ideological extremes, and ultimate market pragmatism. Now let's turn to our third path. This is the story of a nation squeezed directly between those two massive powers. Let's look at Korea's crucible of iron and gold.
If Japan's modernization was a rapid pivot and China's was a slow, agonizing revolution, Korea's path to the modern world is arguably the most violently compressed and dramatic of the three. We have to start at their year zero, 1953, the end of the Korean War.
It is hard to overstate the absolute physical devastation of the Korean peninsula at that moment. The harsh colonial period under Japan, from 1910 to 1945, had already stripped the country of its natural resources and actively suppressed its culture. And then the Korean War rolled back and forth across the peninsula, leaving it divided, traumatized, and in absolute ruins.
Yeah.
South Korea in the 1950s was one of the poorest nations on Earth, entirely dependent on U.S. economic assistance and surplus food just to stave off mass starvation.
They were starting from below zero, and politically they were struggling to find stability. The first president of South Korea, Syngman Rhee, became increasingly autocratic and corrupt, blatantly rigging elections to hold on to power. This culminated in April 1960 when a massive, bloody uprising led by students and ordinary citizens forced Rhee to resign and flee the country.
But that democratic opening was incredibly brief because the military, watching the chaos, decided to intervene. In 1961, General Park Chung-hee seized absolute power in a military coup. And under his deeply authoritarian, highly disciplined leadership, South Korea underwent a period of hyper-accelerated, state-led industrialization that completely transformed the country.
The mechanics of how Park achieved this economic miracle are fascinating and ruthless. The sources outline his shift in strategy. Initially, developing nations often try import substitution, meaning they try to manufacture cheap, basic goods domestically so they don't have to import them.
Makes sense.
But Park looked at South Korea, realized they had almost zero natural resources and a tiny domestic market, and completely scrapped that idea. He aggressively pivoted to an export-oriented policy. He essentially dictated to the nation, we are going to manufacture complex, high-value goods, and we are going to force our way into selling them to the entire global market.
But the government can't build everything itself. So how did he actually execute this? I always hear the term state-led growth, but what does that actually mean on the ground?
It means the creation and weaponization of the chaebols. These were massive, family-run business conglomerates, companies whose names dominate the globe today, like Samsung, Hyundai, and LG. The government actively, aggressively supported these specific families. They provided them with massively subsidized, cheap credit from state-controlled banks, and they threw up high tariffs to shield them from foreign competition in the domestic market.
But it wasn't just free money, right? There was a strict catch.
A very strict catch. Park tied all this government support directly to export quotas. If a chaebol met its aggressive export targets in shipbuilding, steel, or electronics, they got more cheap loans and tax breaks. If they failed to compete on the global market, the government would mercilessly cut off their credit and let them go bankrupt or force them to merge with a rival. It was a brutally effective system of forced corporate evolution.
But it wasn't just top-down industrial policy aimed at billionaires. Park realized he couldn't leave the vast rural population behind. So in 1970, he introduced the Saemal-undong, or the New Village movement.
This is a critical piece of the puzzle. The Saemal movement was a massive, nationwide campaign aimed at completely eradicating rural poverty and fatalism. The government's approach was highly psychological and competitive. The state distributed exactly 335 bags of cement to every single one of the roughly 33,000 rural villages in the country. They told the villagers, use this to improve your community, build a bridge, line a well, widen a road.
And the villages that successfully organized and used the cement efficiently were heavily rewarded with more resources and modern infrastructure in the next round. The villages that fought among themselves or wasted it were completely cut off. It was designed to forcefully shake the rural population out of centuries of passivity and integrate them directly into the national economic project.
And crucially, as the texts note, South Korea was able to pull this off because they had intentionally cultivated a highly literate, incredibly capable workforce, much like Japan had done a century earlier. Despite their poverty, they poured massive cultural and financial resources into education. So the economy absolutely explodes. South Korea becomes a global industrial powerhouse, the miracle on the Han River.
But just like the systems in Japan and China, this hyper-rapid state-directed growth had deep, hidden structural vulnerabilities. The chaebols became too big, too deeply reliant on massive amounts of short-term foreign debt to fund their relentless expansion. And this brings us to a truly incredible defining moment highlighted in the sources, the 1997 IMF crisis.
Yes, by late 1997, the Asian financial crisis swept through the region. Global investors panicked and pulled their money out. The South Korean chaebols, heavily over-leveraged with foreign debt they suddenly couldn't roll over, began to collapse. The national currency, the won, plummeted in value.
Total freefall.
The country's foreign exchange reserves were practically wiped out in weeks. South Korea was literally days away from sovereign default and total economic collapse. The government was forced to go to the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and accept a massive, humiliating bailout package.
And the IMF demands were brutal. Massive layoffs, crippling interest rates, the dismantling of lifelong employment structures. It was a profound psychological trauma for a nation that had sacrificed so much to build its economy. But the reaction of the South Korean people to this crisis is what makes their historical path so utterly unique. The text highlights a specific event, the gold collection movement. We have to dive into the mechanics of this because I find it absolutely staggering.
To help the government pay down the emergency national debt and regain the country's economic sovereignty from the IMF as quickly as possible, ordinary South Korean citizens organized a voluntary campaign to donate their personal gold. And we aren't talking about a few wealthy philanthropists. We are talking about millions of everyday citizens standing in lines, wrapping around city blocks, carrying their personal jewelry boxes.
The details are heart-wrenching. People were donating their gold wedding rings. They were donating the tiny gold rings traditionally given to babies on their first birthdays. Athletes donated their gold medals. Families handed over ancient heirlooms.
It was a profound, almost desperate demonstration of national solidarity. Over 3.5 million citizens participated. They collected roughly 226 tons of gold in just a few months. The government then melted all that personal history down into sterile gold bars and sold it on the international market to repay the IMF loans years ahead of schedule.
That is the ultimate group project success story. You literally have millions of citizens willingly liquidating their most sentimental assets to bail out a macroeconomic national crisis. It shows a level of social cohesion and collective responsibility that is frankly hard to fathom. But there is a deeper political extrapolation here. A population that is that educated, that engaged, and that willing to sacrifice for the preservation of the nation is not a population that will tolerate being indefinitely ruled by an authoritarian dictator.
Exactly, and that is the true overarching arc of the Korean path. The intense economic growth driven by the authoritarian regime laid the physical foundation, but it was the resulting wealth, urbanization, and elevated political awareness of the citizens that inevitably forced the transition to a true democracy. General Park Chung-hee had continuously tightened his grip, culminating in the 1972 Yusin Constitution, which essentially made him a legal dictator for life and brutally suspended democratic rights. He was eventually assassinated by his own intelligence chief in 1979.
But the democratic spirit of the people, the students, and the labor unions kept pushing back against the subsequent military governments throughout the 1980s, often paying a terrible price in blood. The text traces this incredible evolution of democratic maturity, and it culminates beautifully in an event that shocked the world in 2016. At the time, the democratically elected president was Park Geun-hye, who, in a deep historical irony, was the actual daughter of the former dictator, Park Chung-hee.
A massive, bizarre scandal broke out, revealing that President Park had secretly allowed a close personal friend, who held no official government clearance, to heavily manage state affairs, access classified documents, and use presidential power to extort millions of dollars in bribes from the massive chaebols like Samsung.
The betrayal of public trust was absolute, and in response, millions of South Korean citizens took to the streets of Seoul. But unlike the violent, tear gas-filled uprisings of the 1960s and 80s, These protests were completely different.
They were the massive candlelight protests. Every weekend, through the freezing winter, millions of citizens gathered, but they were entirely peaceful. They organized concerts, they brought their children, they cleaned up their own trash at the end of the night. They completely rejected violence, and instead, they relentlessly, peacefully demanded her resignation, strictly within the boundaries of the democratic legal system they had fought so hard to build.
And the system worked. The legislature impeached her. The Constitutional Court unanimously upheld the impeachment. She was legally removed from office in 2017 and later sent to prison. And a completely peaceful democratic transfer of power took place. The contrast is absolutely breathtaking. You look at the timeline. You go from a military coup in a starving nation in 1961 to a high-tech, legal, peaceful, citizen-led impeachment of the most powerful person in the country in 2016. That shows the true, hard-won maturity of the Korean democracy.
It is a phenomenal trajectory, which brings us to the synthesis of everything we've unpacked today. We need to look at the ultimate question posed by these diverse historical sources. How does a nation modernize? How do you gain the necessary technological, economic, and military power to survive in a ruthless, constantly shifting global landscape without completely losing your own cultural soul in the process?
Right. How do you adapt to the heavily armed stranger in your hallway without just becoming a clone of them?
The intellectuals of East Asia grappled with this agonizingly. The text mentions a highly influential, deeply controversial symposium held in Japan in 1943. It was literally titled Overcoming Modernity. They were having this debate right in the middle of the devastation of World War II. The prominent philosopher Nishitani Keiji spoke at it. He defined the concept of modernity not as a universal truth, but strictly as a Western import, the unity of three specific Western historical streams: the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, and the rise of natural sciences.
And his argument was that Japan shouldn't just blindly swallow that Western package whole.
Correct. He argued that Japan had survived colonization because it possessed its own unique moral energy. He believed the ultimate goal of modernization shouldn't just be to endlessly copy the West's factories and imperial aggression, but to somehow integrate Western scientific advancement with Eastern moral philosophy to create a completely new, superior world order.
Of course, the tragic irony is that in 1943, that high-minded philosophical rhetoric was actively being twisted by the state to justify a brutally oppressive, deeply racist military empire across Asia. But stripped of that horrific wartime context, the underlying mechanical question remains entirely valid today. Let's summarize the legacies of the three paths we've explored.
If we look at the two roads to modernization outlined in the conclusion of our sources, we see very distinct long-term legacies. First, Japan. Japan successfully retained its sovereign independence. They brilliantly utilized their pre-existing social cohesion, high literacy, and centralized authority to adapt their economy at lightning speed. However, their elite-driven, top-down imitation of Western imperialism birthed an aggressive, toxic nationalism. It sustained a repressive regime at home, crushed internal demands for true democracy for decades, and established a brutal colonial empire that left a devastating legacy of trauma and hatred across the entire region.
It was an undeniably successful economic and military pivot, but a catastrophic moral and regional one. And then you contrast that with China's path.
China's path was one of immense suffering and total systemic destruction. They suffered heavily from foreign imperialism, the opium trade, and decades of internal warlordism. They eventually concluded that they couldn't just tinker with the edges. They had to violently reject their ancient Confucian traditions entirely to build national strength. The Chinese Communist Party eventually succeeded in doing what the King and the KMT could not, uniting the massive country and creating a highly centralized, fiercely independent state. And since Deng's 1978 pivot, they have achieved staggering, unprecedented economic success through state-managed market reforms.
But the cost of that path is still being paid. As the texts note, the society remains tightly controlled politically. They face massive systemic wealth inequalities. And having spent decades actively trying to violently suppress and destroy their ancient traditions during the Cultural Revolution, the modern state is now grappling with how to develop a cohesive national identity while trying to artificially recover the very cultural heritage they tried to erase.
And finally, we look at Korea, which in many ways offers a synthesis of the two extremes. They were physically obliterated, yet they built a powerhouse, high-tech industrial economy under intense authoritarian pressure. They utilized state-backed chaebols and demanded immense, often painful sacrifice from their citizens, both rural and urban. But ultimately, the wealth, the deep educational investment, and the global integration generated by that strict system inevitably elevated the citizens' political awareness. It empowered the people to peacefully dismantle the very authoritarian structures that built the economy, forging a robust, vibrant, and mature democracy.
Which is an incredibly hopeful trajectory. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to bring this history directly back to you, the listener. Think deeply about your own relationship with the concepts of tradition versus progress, because we are all living through our own era of massive disruption. When you are faced with immense, undeniable pressure in your own life, whether it's the sudden terrifying pressure to constantly upgrade your skills in an AI-driven job market, or to adapt to radical shifts in your industry, or to navigate a rapidly changing social culture, how do you naturally react? Do you take the Japanese approach? Do you favor a rapid, almost aggressive adaptation, shedding your old ways instantly and ruthlessly to survive, even if it means imitating the very forces you fear?
Or do you lean towards the Chinese approach? Do you believe in entirely tearing down the old systems, the old assumptions, and the orthodoxies of your life to build a completely new foundation from scratch, regardless of the chaos and collateral damage it causes in the short term?
Or do you take the Korean approach? Do you focus relentlessly on building up your personal capital, your hard skills, and your economic security under strict, disciplined conditions, with the hope that enduring that pressure now will eventually fund a true personal awakening and systemic freedom later on?
Those are the exact right questions we should be asking ourselves. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you go about your week, building on the profound historical mechanics we've discussed today. The history of East Asia clearly shows us that modernity, being advanced, being successful, being secure, isn't a single monolithic destination. It doesn't have to look exactly like the prevailing Western model or the Silicon Valley model or whatever model is currently dominating your industry. Modernity is simply a tool. And as we all face a massive new wave of global disruption today, the vital question you have to ask yourself isn't whether you'll be forced to modernize and adapt. That door has already been kicked open.
The real question is, when you do inevitably adapt, whose blueprint are you using to rebuild your house? And what parts of your core identity are you willing to sacrifice to build it? What an incredible question to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the paths to modernization. We hope it gave you a new lens to view history and maybe your own trajectory. Until next time, keep diving deep.